Hello, my name is David Lowry, David Shane Lowry. I'm a member of the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, and I'm an anthropologist. Um, the title of this paper that I'm giving to you today, in the next 14 minutes or so, is Indian Pipelines, Science-Based Expertise as Tools of Liberation and Oppression in Native America. So I'll begin. Thank you for this opportunity to present my research on the impacts of environment in American Indian communities. Um, how environment basically helps define American Indian communities, and my research also focuses on how um, pollution and kind of redefinition of environment affects American Indian communities. My anthropological research, which has been funded by the National Science Foundation and other organizations since about 2009, lays the intellectual foundation for understanding the place of contemporary environmental work as a liminal kind of intermediary space smack dab between histories of colonization or colonialism and futures within which we are all hoping for more inclusion of marginalized voices, especially the voices of American Indian scientists. We're also looking for more justice for disenfranchised peoples, i.e., American Indians, and a future that is, at the very least, not dystopic, but hopeful, kind of a look into a utopia that we perhaps could achieve at some point. Within those contexts, my research attempts to build a theoretical framework which I call Indian pipelines that explains how American Indian communities have been sabotaged, and how members of American Indian communities attempt to make lives in the residue of that sabotage. A pipeline, quote unquote, by definition, is something that inundates and remains buried, not inundates, but infiltrates also. So inundates and infiltrates and remains buried deep under the lives of human communities. Yet at the same time, a pipeline is a space of movement, opportunity, and economic advantage if you're positioned in the right way. This goes against theories of American Indian colonialism and post-colonialism, which look at American Indians as being entangled or in some way caught up or bound within settler colonial communities. It attempts to see both sides of the proverbial coin as American Indians live with the devastations of colonial realities that, as it so happens, help define the reasons why American Indians get up every day. Sort of why I attempt to look at the ways that colonization, that colonialism have not only oppressed but have provided the context within which American Indians make lives, make ways, make opportunities in the United States and beyond. I've been studying environment on that note. I've been studying environment in the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina for over a decade. Many Lumbee people work jobs as scientists and engineers for major gas corporations and corporations that manufacture toxic materials. When I approach these people about what their corporations do, they tell me quite quickly that they must get up in the morning and face their jobs without being depressed or in some way preoccupied with the possible harm that they may be doing to their own community. This ongoing tension between career and community health is part of what I call pipeline life, and what I've increasingly started to call pipeline citizenship. In my book in progress, which is called Lumbee Pipelines, Making a Life in the Residue of Settler Society, I state that American Indian communities have a lot to do, have to do a lot of work, to centralize power in their tribal governments, because quite honestly, we American Indians belong to the physical and conceptual pipelines, that define us and separate us. Does that mean that our tribal communities or our tribal governments and the communities around our tribal governments are null and void? No, absolutely not. However, it forces us to resituate, perhaps redesign, the ways that we talk about American Indian and indigenous empowerment in the post-2020 world. When I say Indian pipelines, so when I use that term Indian pipelines, your mind possibly goes to the political conflicts over the Dakota Access Pipelines over the last decade, and for good reason. As the battle over DAPL, as is often referenced, began to take off in late 2016, celebrities and news organizations focused on the Standing Rock community's efforts to protect water and sacred grounds in the shadow of Energy Transfer Partners, or ETP, as they're also known. As a national and global community was looking in, we all began to see a dichotomy sort of set up. Native Americans versus big dirty industry. The images that circulated around news organizations were, in fact, the opponents of DAPL, many of whom were American Indian and not American Indian, being doused with pepper spray and otherwise pushed back by law enforcement. By early 2018, we were hearing about the fight of American Indian / indigenous farmers in Mexico who were fighting the the company TransCanada, as it attempted to push them off their land to make way for the Tuxpan-Tula pipeline. In these moments, I wondered something that perhaps no one else wondered. Who worked for Energy Transfer Partners or for TransCanada? Were there any American Indians working for them? Were there any or around them to kind of support the work that they did? Or were there American Indians helping police and kind of justify the presence of the pipelines that they were trying to lay? While at first these questions may seem odd, and to a degree, sometimes I wonder why I'm asking them. But at first these questions may seem odd, again, because we are used to the ethnic racial dichotomies that have been set up to make American Indians perpetual protesters of colonial encroachment. They are asked for good reason. What was happening at Standing Rock and in Mexico were only a couple of examples of what political scientist Benedict Anderson called imagined communities. As the call for help came from Standing Rock and Mexico, from these indigenous communities asking for help against the pipelines. As these calls went out for help in their efforts to fight the pipelines, the snowball of support created a very powerful assumption that the people pushing protecting pipelines were fighting the people pushing and protecting water and sacred land, and that American Indians simply fell on the latter side, that American Indians, by definition, were protecting land and water. It helped in this moment, to be honest, that Disney's Moana, a movie, came out at the same time during Native American Heritage Month of 2016, and the nationalized call to help No DAPL cast a sharp light on the battle against gas pipelines as one led by pretty much all American Indians. Nike, the global shoe company, made the news when they created a Standing Rock shoe as part of their N7 series of shoes in mid-2018. And I remember watching an advertisement or someone doing a review of that shoe, and they said that the shoe was created because the person said that we know that Native Americans fight for environment. Like, it was sort of an assumption, and this was a non-Native American person. They were stating that we know, quote unquote, we know that Native Americans fight for the environment. So this period of time between 2016 and 2018 was important in our national conversation about Native America and energy pipelines, not for what it revealed necessarily, but for what it covered. In 2017, scientists and community activists from the Lumbee tribe of North Carolina, again, my home, the 9th largest American Indian community in the United States and the largest American Indian community east of the Mississippi, approached the Lumbee tribal government, which would soon itself be faced with a decision whether or not to take $1 million payment from Duke Energy, which is a fairly large energy company in the southeastern U.S., for their blessing on the anticipated Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Scholars such as Ryan Emanuel, who many of you know, reached out to members of the Lumbee tribal government in hopes that they would spur a move within the Lumbee community to combat energy pipelines and related pollutive infrastructure in the Lumbee homeland of Robeson County, North Carolina. In months following, however, we discovered that not only was Lumbee leadership torn over whether or not they should accept the money for their blessing, there was so much more to be worried about. By the beginning of 2019, it became clear that Duke Energy, along with its subsidiary company Piedmont Natural Gas, was busy easing themselves into a position where they could erect a 1 billion cubic foot storage or compression facility in the middle of the swamps in Robeson County. In the late spring of 2019, I attended an open house for Duke and Piedmont Natural Gas in the most rural area of Robeson County and in one of the most important cultural areas of the Lumbee tribe. When I entered the meeting, I expected to hear mostly white executives, engineers, and consultants describing their work to persuade Lumbee people that the LNG facility was safe. I found them, but they were not alone. I also found a consortium of Lumbee people who in various ways were intellectually tied to the science propaganda of Piedmont and Duke. One of them was the administrator of the Lumbee tribe who had a PhD in mathematics and operated a sewage disposal and environmental cleanup company. One of them was a representative of a mostly Lumbee-owned energy cooperative that, according to most people, was simply, quote-unquote, purchasing energy from Duke Energy. Meanwhile, representatives from both Duke and Piedmont seemed persuaded that their relationships with Lumbee River EMC, which was again the name of the Lumbee-owned co-op, had given them the seal of approval to continue to destroy the Lumbee ecosystem. They were in the process, I would soon find out, of naming an educational building at a local community college for Piedmont Natural Gas. In a newspaper article, a representative for Duke Energy stated that she talked to the Lumbee tribal administrator, again, the person who had the mathematics PhD, and that this administrator had told her, the Duke representative, that she would go back to the tribal members and get and obtain their thoughts and concerns about the LNG facility that was being built by Duke in the Lumbee community. And to my knowledge and to the knowledge of many people, those conversations never took place. So what am I getting at here? What does it mean for there to be fuzzy lines in these relationships of environmental pollution that we know by definition more regularly affect non-white people that offer a particularly toxic punch to American Indian communities? Even though we do not live in a post-racial society, we live in a society in which we see environmental toxicity covered underneath claims of good faith efforts to include and diversify input within economies of environmental engineering. Indeed, although natural gas and oil pipelines have been shown to overwhelmingly inundate American Indian and Black communities across the United States and North America, the labor force within the market of energy is much more inclusive. What do I mean by that? What do I mean by that? This battle for labor force inclusivity begins in the trenches of American education. The American Indian Science and Engineering Society, for example, sponsors a national conference each year. In past decades, the major sponsors were NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or highly specialized corporations like 3M or DuPont. In recent years, it's become common to see energy companies such as Exxon and Chevron on advertisements, along with tribal governments like the Poarch Creek Indians of Alabama and social media conglomerates like Facebook. American Indian students in schools such as MIT, Georgia Tech, NC State, and others are approached by energy corporations that attempt to make natural resource extraction in tribal worlds part of the moving and shaking of Native America. American Indian thinkers are taught to become cogs in the motors of extraction, only valuable as they serve to work, protect, and engineer for corporate governmental interests that are not usually beneficial to American Indian health. However, the tension that is seen in these relationships, e.g. between American Indian health and American Indian economic opportunity, is nothing that is going away. It is at the core of a host of conceptual and physical pipelines that run through American Indian communities that can be described as both beneficial and deadly. Indeed, if you go back and look at who hosts the ACES conference, the American Indian Science and Engineering Society that I was just mentioning, any of the corporate sponsors will have an orchestrated corporate response to accusations that they do harm. Facebook, for example, is a platform for bullying. I think there's tons of research about social media bullying. Are they selling themselves as such? Of course not. But they are here to stay. Their pipeline, their social media virtual pipeline is here to stay. Whether gas pipelines, social media platforms, chemical processing factories such as DuPont, which turned into a company called Chemours, which is still fighting accusations that it has polluted and still pollutes the Lumbee environment in North Carolina, or any other conduit of movement. These all remain interesting pipelines that merge a deep history of American Indian disenfranchisement with a call for hope. Exxon doesn't allow us to dwell on how it has helped lay a national network of pipelines which will continue to corrode sacred land. Rather, it has come to a point in its corporate history where it hopes to help its image by creating jobs, economic opportunities, professional opportunities for American Indian students. What all of these examples of American Indian people and their tangible and conceptual pipelines pushes us towards is a more concerted look at the integration of American Indian science into the needed integration of American Indian science into the geophysical sciences. This means, quite honestly, that we need American Indians with different relationships with these conceptual and tangible pipelines at the center of discussions of justice. Just because we don't agree in this particular moment about what direction we as American Indians ought to go doesn't mean that we cannot speak as American Indians in the science community. Everyone must make room, all the corporations, governments, etc., for these disagreements, for these different relationships that American Indians have with these conceptual and actual pipelines to be placed back, and there must be a placing back of American Indian community and science voice onto the central stage. This is true decolonization, not the formation of a unified message of addressing a common colonial adversary, but rather a turn of the national and global science gaze toward communities of American Indian and indigenous scientists that are also entrepreneurs and whose plurality of thought defines American Indian and indigenous science. Thank you.